Hi, my name is Amanda Casari. My pronouns are she, her, and today is October 5th, 2023, and I'm speaking with Clare Dillon. We are recording this conversation for Open Source Stories. I'm currently in what New Englanders in Vermont call peak foliage season. So all the deciduous trees around me are in full autumn colors and shedding their leaves as quickly as they possibly can. Clare, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, indeed. My name is Clare Dillon, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm unfortunately not in that part of the world where there's peak foliage season, and I am in Dublin, Ireland, where it is alternatively miserable and sunny and cold and warm, all in the period of about an hour. So we don't know what to do over this part of the world, but that's part of autumn or fall in this part of the world. So we'll live with it.
Yes. No, I think that's absolutely. I do not take for granted that the part of the world I live in right now is also this weekend peak tourist season. So people come from all over the world to visit, it's nice to be here when you're not having to travel to it. And sometimes also helps you experience and appreciate the seasons elsewhere too.
That's true.
So to kick things off, Clare, we do like to kind of start with non-technology questions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, is there anything bringing you joy lately?
Oh, bringing me joy. Actually, I mean, interestingly, the weather, when it is nice, is absolutely bringing me joy. I do love a crisp autumn day. We don't get enough of them here in Dublin in the way I like them, but a walk in a wooded park on a crisp autumn day is probably my best nature experience going. So I do love that, and I've had a few lately, so that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Oh, fantastic. Is there anything special that you do with the walk that makes it like extra fantastic besides the weather?
Leaves. Can I say kick the leaves?
Yes, absolutely.
I don't think that joy from that ever goes away. So a good old rummage in the leaves, chasing my dog is probably what we're talking about here.
Yes. I do the same. I especially like it when they're so high because I have a low dog. She's a corgi with short legs. So sometimes it's like watching a little submarine go through piles, which is my absolute favorite. Yes. It's awesome. Yeah, well, I hope you get more of that, especially before the weather changes completely.
Me too. It's the problem here is when we get the rain, then they all turn soggy. That's not quite so joyful.
No, that's more of like the leaf sludge than it is the leaf like romp, right? Yeah. Awesome. Well, so when you're not romping in the leaves with your dog, you are quite prolific in some of the areas that we work in open source together. And I'm just curious, how would you describe and how do you describe your work in open source, both to folks who are very familiar and also folks who are not so familiar?
Well, thank you for describing it as prolific. I call it dabbling, here, there, and everywhere, but we'll go with prolific. That sounds great to me. So I suppose in the open source world, my work actually in this sphere covers both the open source world and the inner source world, and I see them both as being very interlinked. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the inner source concept, it's the idea of using open source methods and practices, but within organizations to create proprietary code. And that's actually how I came about joining, I suppose, the open source community, because the community for inner source practitioners, Inner Source Commons, that was my first introduction to open source, because to be part of that community and to contribute to the Inner Source Commons, you have to do it in the open. It's an open source project itself. And that, in fact, was my very first PR commit in the open source world, was for Inner Source Commons. And that was my introduction to doing open source. And it was interestingly through that community that I became involved or more interested in the work that was happening in open source program offices, because a lot of the folks who had been involved in Inner Source Commons worked in open source program offices. They were rolling out education programs around open source practices and things like that within their organizations. And so that involvement introduced me to this concept of open source program offices. I became involved in some of the communities that were looking at how you encourage the creation of open source program offices in public sector. So I worked in that area for a while. And through that work, I became much more involved in understanding a little bit more about the social and economic potential of open source beyond the open source practices, which I was already a fan of. So inner source is all about how you collaborate, how that makes it a wonderful experience for software developers. I'd already bought into all of that. That was brilliant. Love that. Want to do more of that. Think the world should be doing more of that. But when I got more involved then with the open source program offices and public sector in particular, I began to become more aware of the potential for open source as a whole to have a really good, positive, both social and economic impact for everyone involved in its creation, use. Just the fact that it's there in the world is a better thing for many people in various different economies. So that was my pathway then to get more involved with open source program offices. And as a result of this kind of journey, I ended up co-founding Open Ireland Network, which is a community in Ireland specifically, which is about trying to promote and advocate for open source at a national level in Ireland. That's it's a group of organizations and individuals who are interested in that in Ireland. So like I said, I dabble in many areas, but all of them incredibly rewarding, and really love the area.
Yeah, and as I will say, as someone else who I feel like has a very nonlinear experience and progression, I love how you're able to describe too. It's kind of this one piece kind of leads to the next, right?
Yes.
Which is very much the way that I think the community, the technology, and things have grown in general.
Yes, well, I mean, I think it's a factor and an attribute of the whole ecosystem. So, open source, folks in open source and inner source actually talk about being able to scratch your own itch. I mean, part of the whole thing is the agency it gives you, right? That in everyone in these areas are able to follow their passions in as much as they follow whatever they're being told to do in maybe in their role or their job. But open source and inner source kind of gives you that freedom to a certain degree to be able to explore what your interests are, and I love that about it. And in fact, more recently, I've actually moved. So from my experiences with Inner Source Commons, I actually became the inaugural executive director there for 2 years. But recently, I stepped down from that role to move into an academic role. So I'm actually now doing even more exploration and research around the topic of inner source. But again, that was another step on the journey. I would never have found out about that opportunity had I not been involved in Inner Source Commons and the open source community in Ireland. And one thing leads to another. It's a fantastic opportunity, a fantastic journey and experience.
Oh, congratulations on the next step as well. Are there any research questions in particular that you are like fascinated by, or that you would be happy to share that you're working on right now?
Well, I have to kind of put a proviso at the start of this to say that my biggest learning in the whole PhD experience and research experience is that this is subject to change. In fact, I've already had one major pivot already in my first year, and apparently that's okay. Don't panic, Claire. I keep saying that every morning. But currently, one of the main areas that I'm particularly fascinated about is the idea of ownership concepts in inner source or collaborative code development in general. Yeah. So the idea of how people consider ownership. Even if they both talk about, if two groups talk about code ownership, do they mean the same thing? Often they don't, it turns out. I've talked to one organization who had 6 different definitions of what ownership meant, and they couldn't actually agree that it might be a good idea to have one definition. They were like, oh, no, we're all fine having 6 different definitions. And you're like, well, that could cause confusion when, and perhaps conflict when people are trying to collaborate on things and we have 2 different definitions of who owns what. But so I love that. I love that whole area of exploration, because I think it involves both organizational constraints, but it also involves psychology to some degree as well. So it's an interesting area to explore.
Yes, I completely empathize and sympathize with the researcher aspect of, wouldn't it be nice if we had one definition to rule them all, and the rest of reality telling you, that sounds nice, that's not the way it's going to work.
Sure, it keeps us busy. That's what I say. That's exactly what we're here for.
So I do want to so you'd mentioned the pivot and the research pivot, and because I want to, as someone else who likes to discuss things don't work out the way you expected them to. Is there anything else about that experience where you had to make a shift of assumptions you were making and the direction you were going that you'd be willing to share with us today?
Well, I mean, part of the pivot I didn't actually share right now. So one of the realizations that I had in my first year is that, and again, I hear this is a common complaint among early stage PhD candidates. Yeah. But yeah, I was trying to boil the ocean. So I was looking at a much too broad a set of areas, and I think I even just described them there. My interest areas do spread right through from right from the whole idea of how organizations and how they're constructed can constrain and limit collaboration opportunities, right through to the bit that I love, which is that psychology piece, which is, don't touch my code, it's my baby. I don't,
Yes.
I might say I want you to contribute to this, but I don't really think you're worthy, that kind of thing. that sort of perception can sometimes come into limiting collaboration within organizations, or certainly that's the feedback we hear from our community in InnerSource Commons. I love all that, but it's far too broad. So now, what the biggest kind of realization is that I really need to kind of limit what I'm looking at in the early stages. Maybe I'll go further into the psychology areas later, but that's such a broad area to actually visit that I think I might be better off with something that's a little bit more well defined earlier, and maybe I'll move there in later years.
Yeah. I'm sincerely hoping that you do have the opportunity to do that. I have talked with folks before, especially contributors. I think that, that concept around contribution models, where people fit in, where we ask and invite, I don't know that I see enough conversation around also how, not ego, but fear plays a role in how folks decide to share things, or what happens when they do share their work, and if that work becomes popular or used to a level that they either did not anticipate, or maybe they're now concerned about, if I no longer want to work on this, or if I move away from this, what does that do for me? Not just reputationally, but like, what does that do for my opportunity to get a job? What does that do for my opportunity to have future professional career? And there is actually a lot of fear that exists, I think, for folks that we tend to attribute towards maybe other aspects, but at its heart, it comes down to a separate set of questions or intentions.
Yeah, and I love that. And actually that idea of fear and the triggers for psychological fear and our physiological reaction to that, I find that fascinating. I actually did a talk on that in FOSS Backstage last year. It was around this whole idea of triggers and the SCARF model by David Rock, which is actually an entire psychological framework for describing how we inadvertently trigger people's basically lizard brain and cause this kind of panic reaction, and why and how that can actually be come up all the time when we're having these conversations about, but sure, why wouldn't you open your code, and why wouldn't you collaborate openly? And we just assume that that's the right thing to do, but we don't realize that we're sometimes attacking people's feelings of security, or their feelings of certainty, or even their understanding of connectivity and how they interact with other people. So there's so many different of these psychological frameworks that if we look at them, you can immediately see how they actually do impact people's, and whether it's even consciously or subconsciously, it's impacting people's reactions and their the way that they collaborate with others. And fundamentally, it comes down to this idea of trust and trusting relationships, and how do we build that? Because that's where it not only gives you where it kind of reduces any of the conflict areas, but it actually can believe it or not, drive you to have feelings like where all the positive hormones are released, and all this, serotonin, and all these sort of things, like if you're eating chocolate or falling in love. And there's all sorts of research that would say that when we do it right, it can be really, really wonderful, positive experience that everyone, and that's why everyone says that developer satisfaction goes up when you start working in an open collaborative way. Partially because all of these really good feelings come about when we feel like we're working well with other people, but that's all coming from the psychology side of things, and that whole that interaction between our physiology and psychology. I think it's fascinating. But I didn't even mention that in the first list. You see, this could go on forever, this research.
Oh yeah, no, this is fantastic, because now I'm super curious as if you have not found this yet, or if you are a suspect around where that differences may also lie with the difference between inner source and open source. Because initially I was like, well, maybe the inner source is a trusted group, but then at the same time, maybe it's actually higher risk, because these are folks who are much closer to you and have a very immediate ability to have an impact on your organizational success, on your professional success, in a way that has different constraint models. And even though it's like a different kind of scale and maybe has higher weight, So now I'm super curious about that as well.
I think there are pros and cons to that, because I mean, it's definitely a different environment. And I think there are also what I usually think about is the fact that there are different levers to pull when you're in a consistent environment. So for example, if you are trying to create or reward collaborative behavior, you probably have more ways to do that within an organization than you perhaps do in an open source project, because you don't know, or you don't have even the legal means by which to reward people, or, you know, it may be a much more diverse community that you're trying to work with. But when you're inside an organization, you've got things like bonuses, you've got things like, you know, you've well-established ways to call people out in a good way and reward their behavior. So there are different levers to pull. Some of the scenarios that we would talk about seem very similar to the kind of contexts and scenarios that you hear about in the open source community, like, you know, conflicts between people who just are different types of people and interact in different ways or communicate in different ways will happen whether you're in an organization or whether you're out in, you know, in an open source community where you don't know where people are coming from. So there are some fundamentals to, I suppose, great communication, how you communicate with people, how you would acknowledge their contributions. All of those sort of things are kind of consistent principles. But as I said, maybe different levers that you can pull within organizations that you may not be able to pull in the open source community. But vice versa, there are some things that happen in the open source community that perhaps are constrained within a corporation. So, you know, that you know, I've met folks in corporations who are doing both inner source and perhaps even open source, where they are so scared. We talked about this fear earlier. They're so scared of triggering some corporate bureaucratic process or slap on the wrist, that they're afraid to do things in the open or say something that they might otherwise say. Whereas there's much less of a fear of that in the open source community. So pros and cons, I think, things that you can that are better and some are worse.
Yeah. So speaking of pros and cons, what do you think is open source's greatest remaining potential? Like for like the thing that kind of keeps you involved and keeps you moving forward? Potential.
The greatest potential is getting it out from just developers, in my mind. So I say this, I'm biased. I come from, I'm not really a techie in that respect. I'm not a developer. So my first pull request involved a lot of, what button do I press here now? And, you know,
yeah. Everybody's does, right?
Fair enough. Maybe that's not just not like people, but I did come from that world, and I think you know, I've always worked with developers, but I would never necessarily wouldn't be let alone with a you know, building anything by myself or anything like that. But I would say that I think that there is a huge potential to introduce more people who do not have a technical background to both inner source and open source, because it is a wonderful way to collaborate. And I remember the joy I got on when my first contribution was accepted. My first PR was merged, and I mean, I literally went on a high. I was like, "This is amazing!" I went to make a change, and then I went and figured out how to do it, and I did it with help. And look at this! I can see my change there. And I was going around going. And I remember people saying, you know, it's not always this pleasant. And I was like, but this is just, everyone should be doing this. Why doesn't everyone know the power of like collaboration? And I had to be reminded that perhaps it's not always such a pleasant experience. And sometimes it's a long, lonely road. But at the same time, when you find the right community where people are there willing to help and mentor and just encourage each other, that for me, I feel lucky enough to have my first experience be in Inner Source Commons, where I feel that was the kind of community it is. It's so much potential to bring in people so far beyond, I think, where we even think now that people can be involved. And certainly my work more recently in the academic space, where most of the folks who are thinking about open source in the academic space are dealing with people who are not developers at all. Like, you know, they do software development maybe as a secondary, maybe even a third level competency beyond their first major area of concern. It's just something that has to be done to maybe get their research out in the world. Right. And I think about that, and I think about how the open source world and the inner source world need to be aware of the fact and cognizant of the fact that a lot of our language and communication assumes a knowledge of technology, maybe, or assumes a software development background. And how can we open that up so that more people get that joy and the value of that collaborative creation and sharing? It's so powerful, and it's just so the way things should be done. So I think more people should get it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I'm so sorry because I realize we are actually running really up on time. I have very many more questions to ask you, but I do want to keep like I want to make sure we get two in at the end. So one of them is so where do you see so more people get involved, things are happening, commons exist. What do you hope to see in open source for the next 5 to 10 years, which is a shorter timeline than we actually, I think, all take for granted?
Yeah. What do I hope to see? I think there's a lot of things changing in open source at the moment. There's a lot of, everything from, how do we define open source AI to regulatory changes in places like Europe, which was a very big topic most recently around the Cyber Resiliency Act. People don't understand how that's going to impact open source. My hope for the next 5 years is twofold. It's one, that more people understand the value and the potential and of the social and economic impact of open source, as well as that great psychological benefit that can come with it. So that would have always been my hope. But that is now, I think it's even more challenging in the current complex scenario. So I would also hope that we get through this area of ambiguity to maybe get clarity about the impact and how we can deal with that in the open source community as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's I think it's spot on for the where we are now and where we need to address things immediately and where we're also concerned for long term. So thank you. So last one, unfortunately, because I could talk to you, we have to do this again. Do you have any parting thoughts or words of advice for listeners today?
Ooh, parting words of advice. I would say, I'm hoping that everyone listening to this has had a marvelous experience of being part of an open source community. If you haven't, and this is your, I'm just considering it, please do try and find a great community and have a go, because it's just so rewarding. And if you have, tell someone about it. Tell someone who's not a techie, who you would not imagine might appreciate it, but perhaps should try it. Maybe that's my parting advice, or ask for people.
No, I love that. I love the don't just open the door, but open the door and invite people in, right? As to like when and if you haven't found the right door, there's other ones which you can
try another one.
And
yeah.
they would love you to be there. Well, wonderful.
Indeed.
Thank you, Claire, so much for joining us today. I'm sorry this was such a short time, but it was a delight, and hopefully we can speak again soon.
Thank you, Amanda. I'd look forward to that. Thanks so much.